This idea that the Americans and the Russians are going to ally up against the Chinese, Europe left stranded, what's Europe going to do? The penny seems to have dropped in Europe, finally. The Russians must think this is manna from heaven. They just can't believe their luck. And we've seen that in terms of Russia's going back to its maximalist demands, means regime change in effect.
We've just seen in the last few minutes, actually, that Poland has confirmed that there is no US aid coming into Ukraine over the Polish border. Obviously, this is a huge development in things. What's your initial reaction to this?
Well, very disappointing, sad. I guess one conclusion from the White House meeting on Friday was that clearly the Trump administration is in the Putin camp, right? I mean, NATO is kind of dead. Any idea that the US will provide some kind of security guarantee to NATO and any peacekeeping operation in Ukraine is also, it's pretty clear that's not going to happen. So, I mean, the only positive for Ukraine, I guess, is that it's clear now where it stands. It's clear where it stands in respect to the US. And it has to make its decisions accordingly, I guess, right?
Can you kind of place that historically in terms of how significant these events are that we're seeing?
To be honest, it's utterly shocking. If you think the mainstay of European security since the Second World War has been NATO, NATO, and certainly I think people like J.D. Vance forget that, US triggered Article 5 after 9/11, right? NATO allies rallied around the US. It's interesting, again, over the last few hours, or 24 hours at least, Vance has been criticising some European countries in terms of their military capability. That's not gone down very well in the UK, in particular, given that the UK and European countries stood also behind the US in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, we lost, I think, around 800 soldiers in both conflicts. So, there's a lot of, it is simply extraordinary, right? I mean, I have to say, that we need to think of a new security architecture in Europe. We're seeing huge shifts, teutonic shifts in alliances that I don't think anyone could quite have imagined, right? This idea that the Americans and the Russians are going to ally up against the Chinese, Europe left stranded, what's Europe going to do? I mean, just utterly extraordinary, right? And I mean, the penny seems to have dropped in Europe, finally. They realise that they need to increase their own defence spending and ramp up military production. Obviously, we've had announcements this morning from van der Leyen and various European politicians in that regard. But, in the end, there is a short-term gap. We all get that. I mean, years of underinvestment, years of neglect in terms of spending on defence spending have left us dependent on the Americans, right? Going forward, that can't endure, right? We have to change. How we get through the transition period is kind of difficult. And the immediate problem is obviously Ukraine, right? How we help Ukraine get through this existential threat to its survival, right? And I guess longer term, Europe has to see Ukraine as being pretty central to its own defence with the Americans gone, right? I mean, Ukraine is a very capable military force. Almost the only thing standing behind Europe and Russia at the moment is Ukraine. So how we better work with the Ukrainians to help build our own defence. I mean, that's a huge question mark. So, I mean, utterly staggered. I mean, you asked, how do I put it into perspective? I mean, it's just extraordinary, right? I mean, in context, I mean, it's almost like the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? If you think of the scale of what we're seeing now, again, these shifting alliances, utterly remarkable.
Is it fair to say that the ramifications of this change are going to be largely negative?
The collapse of the Soviet Union set in motion many of the problems that we're dealing with today. I mean, essentially, we spent the peace dividend. We assumed we'd won the Cold War, and now those chickens are coming home to roost, I guess. But we need to move on, right? I mean, that's the reality. We are where we are. It's crystal clear now that the US is not a reliable partner. Europe has some leverage, I think, has leverage in terms of it will, it's a big economy, $27 trillion. It has buying power. I think that I'm not worried about the finances of stepping up defense production. I'm just worried about the physical challenge of actually producing and buying weapons, right? In the short term, you'd imagine the Americans would still be willing to sell them to Europe. It would be a huge market. And then eventually Europe will step up and will be a significant arms producer. And again, I would imagine that would give it leverage also with the Americans. If in the end, this is a hegemonic battle for supremacy between the US and China, I do find it a bit ironic or a bit strange that the Americans have decided to tag along to the Russian economy, which is a $2 trillion economy. Ultimately, I don't see Russia giving the US the scale in terms of that hegemonic battle with China. Europe is the economy that can give the Americans scale. So we have leverage. We have leverage in the short term in terms of purchases of weapons, big arms procurement deals that can give jobs to Trump and the US economy. And then the longer term, I think it's very hard for the Americans to ignore the sheer scale of the European economy and its ability to help in terms of that hegemonic battle with the Chinese. And ultimately, if the Americans decide to do something else, then Europe should look for alternatives, right? It should look to improve its relations with China. It should look for better relations with Turkey and the Gulf states, right? It should diversify its own national security.
So you wrote an op-ed recently this week, and in that you mentioned this phrase which has been talked about quite a bit, about a reverse Nixon. Can you just explain what that is in geopolitical terms? If
you think of the Nixon presidency, he essentially, I guess, saw the primary threat to the US in the 70s as Russia, the Soviet Union, and he improved relations with China to try and isolate Russia from China. And, if you think of the opening of China, that was the basis of the development we've seen, the remarkable development we've seen in China over the last 40 years was that kind of process. The reverse Nixonian, I guess, is the US views China as the primary threat to its supremacy. So it's looking to ally with Russia against China, which is the opposite of what it did under Nixon.
At least in the short term, is Russia the main winner out of all this that's happening at the moment?
Well, specifically in respect to Ukraine, you've got to think so, yes. It's extraordinary that Trump went into negotiations with Russia over Ukraine, I would say with a strong negotiating hand, right? He could have ramped up sanctions, could have ramped up military supplies to Ukraine. There was lots of stuff to negotiate on. Territory, NATO membership, bilateral security guarantees, sanctions. And kind of he's given everything away before there's been any negotiations. It's quite extraordinary. The Russians must think this is manna from heaven. They just can't believe their luck. And we've seen that in terms of Russia's going back to its maximalist demands, which is, this idea of denazification of Kyiv, which means regime change in effect. Ukraine is not a Nazi state, it's a democracy, but the Russians, like to push that kind of angle. And also demilitarization of Ukraine, which essentially means putting limitations on Ukraine's conventional military capability and its ability to defend itself because they want to invade again. So, and unfortunately, because of Trump's shenanigans, the start of the negotiations have shifted significantly east. We could have started around NATO membership. Ukraine may not have, unlikely to have been given NATO membership, but it would have then have given some leverage for the negotiating team from the West, the US, to negotiate the minimum security guarantees for Ukraine, which would have been given it full access to NATO's conventional military capability, right? Arming the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves, I would have thought, would have been the minimum needed in terms of Ukraine's security.
So obviously a lot of this is in the context of negotiations around this mineral deal, and there's a chance that the freezing of aid is just a temporary thing and it's all designed to strong-arm Zelensky in Ukraine into signing this mineral deal. But there's obviously a lot of damage being caused along the way in terms of disinformation and reputations and things like that. What are your thoughts on that?
We've already seen the damage to NATO itself, right, in this process. Faith and trust in NATO it's very badly damaged in Europe, right? Trust in the US as an ally, very badly damaged. The scenes in the White House, it may well have gone down well amongst some MAGA supporters in the US, but I think from a world perspective, any foreign observer looking at that would say that this is just another US ally that's been let down by the Americans, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Vietnam. I mean, you could give us a very long list of partners that the Americans have not stood by, right? So I think that's very damaging to the US over the longer term. The minerals deal. I mean, what seems to be the case is Trump seems to want a quick deal. He wants a quick win. He views the mineral deal as that. He views a ceasefire deal as a quick win. And Trump's not very good on the detail, right? I mean, I think the problem most Europeans have with the White House thinking around a ceasefire is, we've been there before. We've been there before with Minsk 1, Minsk 2, numerous ceasefires have been broken. And Zelensky in the White House was quite right. In the end, Ukraine's future depends on some assurance on security. What assurance is there from this mineral deal? I mean, there's nothing written down on paper from the Americans' point of view. Trump seems to suggest that the mere presence of American companies on the ground in Ukraine is assurance enough. That wasn't the reality the last time Trump was in office in 16 to 20, when US companies were on the ground and US companies, their assets were hit. And Putin didn't abide by, any ceasefires agreed. So I mean, look, it's all pretty worrying for Ukraine. The Ukraine has a good long-term outlook, economic position could be good with EU accession, recovery, reconstruction builds, but it needs security. Investors will not invest in Ukraine. I mean, it's interesting, the minerals deal. No investor will invest around this minerals deal if they don't feel Ukraine is secure. And how do you ensure security? That's the key question. The deal itself is not sufficient enough.
Is there a chance that this could all backfire for the Trump administration? Could they find themselves in a position where the reaction to what has happened with Ukraine completely sidelines them as a global superpower?
Well, I think it weakens trust and confidence in the Americans. I would think Europe will be looking for alternatives, right? And if the Americans come asking for European help against China or another 9/11, I think Europe will say, no, thank you. You made your choices on Ukraine. We're making our choices, right? So ultimately, I think this weakens the US, doesn't strengthen it. And, we could end up for Trump himself. I mean, mismanaging this peace process could be politically very damaging for him. This could be in terms of scale, multiples more damaging than Afghanistan. Again, the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, any deal that doesn't leave Ukraine secure could see the military collapse of Ukraine and then social, economic and political collapse of Ukraine and a complete victory of Russia over Ukraine. And I think that would be a devastating blow to European security and political and social instability also, because I think tens of Ukrainians would move west. And that would be Trump's responsibility. He would have caused that. Again, going into negotiations where he had a strong negotiating hand. Does he care? Does he really understand any of this? I have my doubts.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more interviews like this, please do consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent. You can sign up at kyivindependent.com/membership.